Hi, good evening to everyone. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan, and I'm a physician who has been focused on autoimmunity in severe COVID 19 since early 2020. We've published two papers on this, and we've been focused on the fact that we thought that the viral response in a select small number of the population caused an autoimmune response damaging the lungs and the heart and the kidneys. And it was because of the response to serum or free floating ACE2. That's something I've covered before. But because of this thinking with regards to severe COVID 19, it has allowed me to reflect on what we may be seeing now, 2 years down the line or 3 years down the line since I've predicted it, and assess where things are likely to go. Now, let's be clear, I'm not here to make people happy in the sense that I'm not here to respond to good news. That's not what I'm doing. I am trying to assess risk. I'm looking at ways that we can mitigate risk. So I come from a clinical perspective, and from a clinical perspective, we always anticipate the worst. A shadow in the lung, we think it's cancer. We don't ignore it. We try and make sure it isn't that. But to not look for cancer would not be responsible. In the same way, because of my research into autoimmunity, I anticipate the worst. I am looking for the fact that these autoimmune responses can continue to occur and may cause problems 5 to 10 years down the line. So that's what I look for. That's where my focus is. So, for anyone who is expecting me to say anything different, you will find that I never do. It's always the same point. Autoimmunity, is it occurring? How will it present? So that has led me to a very interesting exploration. This is what I'll be taking you through. And I'll show you essentially that I'll be going through this paper, Pathogenic Responses Among Young Adults During the 1980 Influenza Pandemic. This was published in 2012. I thought it was interesting and I thought I would take you through that point. Before I start, I'd just like to encourage those people who are interested in some of the other bits that I've looked at. These are some courses that are available at Macmillan Research Education. The support would be appreciated. If not, you can always take a look at our videos. I've collated them in the context of the most popular to the very popular to the popular that are collated here on Macmillan Research in case you don't know where to find them on YouTube or otherwise. So, getting back to the point in hand, why am I worried about this? And I'm not sure what year this will occur, but truthfully, based on the research that I have been doing, I sadly think this is inevitable. I'd like to be wrong, but as I told you, my aim is not to assume that I'm wrong, but to assume I'm right and to see if there's anything we can do to mitigate what seems to be an inevitable consequence of some of the actions that were taken during the pandemic. For anyone who has heard my first interview with Gert van den Bosch, you will know what I'm talking about. So he who is listening will understand. So let's start off with a few things that are quite straightforward. So this paper, as I said, was published in 2012, February 2012. Emerging Infectious Diseases. This was the publication, and it was by Dennis Shanks and a John Brundage. And they were looking at the unexplained characteristics of the 1918 influenza pandemic. And they were focused on an extremely high mortality rate among young adults. What they call a W shaped mortality curve was very unusual. And they recognized that there was a lack of coherent explanation of this and other epidemiological and clinical manifestations. So, this was what they were focused on. And I like that. I like people who ask questions that don't always seem to make sense. They don't stop at just saying, okay, we don't understand why. They keep on looking for answers. And I think that's a very, very good thing. Now, what they focused on again, and this is again seen full screen here, is that their historical records and from the laboratory animal studies suggest that there were two viruses, influenza viruses, that were relevant. One was the AH3NX, which was the 1890 pandemic strain. And then there was the AH1N1 1918 pandemic strain. Now, I think this is still the same version that is circulating, or I mean, variants of this. And so, in reality, this is not necessarily a problem with regards to influenza. I'm just looking at what happened with influenza, which was unusual at that time, and I'm correlating it to what I think could be relevant now in the context of the COVID 19 pandemic, or you could say epidemic of highly vaccinated regions. I challenge anyone to find me a country at the moment across the world that has low rates that is having a problem with continuing circulation of Omicron. That's another scientific question that shouldn't be ignored. But let's move on. So, as we continue on with regards to this paper here, they highlighted that the influenza pandemic of 1918-19 was the single most deadly event in recorded history. Can this be beaten by COVID 19? So, and I usually say this in the first wave, it killed 2 million. In the second wave, it was upwards of 50 million. If we see anything like that in the context of COVID 19, in the first wave, and I call the first three waves the first wave because they all were slightly related, and that was about 6.5 million. Multiply that by 25, and you would have something that is equivalent to what happened in the flu pandemic of 1918. This is quite serious. And so when we talk about excess mortality, we're talking about hundreds of millions. It's almost too frightening to consider. But you have to remember that we have already been through something that no one in the Western world thought could have happened, which was lockdowns because of the pandemic, blocked hospitals. It was inconceivable in early 2018 or 19. It happened. And in the same way, studying history will give us some insight into what else could go wrong. So let's continue along with this paper. So, as they were saying, because of the severe consequences and current relevance of the 1918 pandemic, it's essential to review its events and effects and determine the underlying cause. And so they were focused on a number of things around it. They were lucky, as they said. Fortunately, abundant and detailed written records exist of clinical, lab, and epidemiological events during the pandemic period. And so they were able to capture all of those factors in the context of the pandemic. And they put them together in this paper to give us an insight into some of the things that were happening. So, moving into where the deaths occurred and potentially why they occurred. So, the mortality and case fatality rates, they were highlighting that actually during the 1918 pandemic, the influenza infection rates were similar as to other pandemics in the last century, and the overall mortality rates were less than 1%. And actually, we've seen a similar thing with regards to the COVID 19 pandemic. Some people will say that the numbers were overblown, and I think that there is some truth to that assertion. However, you have to remember that certainly from a clinical context, it presented in such an unusual way and had such severe disease. That's not something that we see in a flu epidemic that it had seen before. So this was extremely unusual. And they found that most of the deaths occurred within about 7 days of illness, onset of illness. And this is the bit that is very important. Let's go back to the paper here. So, as I said, most of the deaths occurred within about 7 days of the onset of illness and were the result of secondary bacterial pneumonia caused by common colonizers of the respiratory tract. This is a bit that I think is extremely relevant. And this is where I think we are going to run into problems Because what they're highlighting here is that actually it was not the influenza virus that caused the damage, that caused the death. The influenza virus seems to have damaged the lungs. The lungs then get infected by bacteria that are normal commensals, and then that is what caused the mortality. Now, you would think that things are a bit better now because they didn't have access to antibiotics then. And so antibiotics at that time could have made a huge difference. But would it have stopped that very steep mortality response that they had seen? So let's move on to what happened in young adults. So in that time, the illness rates were highest among children of school age. The mortality rates were highest among infants, young adults, and the elderly. And this is what was the W shaped, what they call the W shaped relationship between mortality rate and age that was quite unique and unexplained in the characteristics of the 1918 pandemic. Here's an important point. And so this is the image here that they're talking about with regards to the W-shaped curve. So it's the black line here. So the infants here had high mortality, lower for the age groups 5 to about 14, and then it peaked again here. And this is actually about the 25 to 29 age group. And then it comes down here for ages about 50 to 65, and then it goes up again in the elderly. So that's what they call the W-shaped curve. Now, as I had said early in the pandemic, one of the unusual characteristics were that infants, neonates, weren't particularly affected by COVID 19, and neither were children. This is why nobody was rushing at the early stage of the pandemic to vaccinate the children because they were at such low risk. That in itself should have been a curious scientific question. Why were neonates, especially neonates with a poor immune system, not far more severely affected in terms of the first wave of COVID 19? I differentiate it by what is happening now. This is a completely different ballgame because we've changed the field significantly, and we are now reaping outcomes from the actions that we had taken before. That again needs to be clearly analyzed and reflected by the scientific community. But certainly in the early part of the pandemic, the youngest, remarkably, were not significantly affected, except if they had comorbidities. That may have been, and even then, it was still a very small number. So, moving on in terms of the paper. Here we have the timing and characteristics of the epidemic waves. Now, they had three distinct waves, they said, in 1918 to 1919. The first wave was mid 1918. So, most locations, it caused widespread illness, but few deaths. It's what they call the 3-day fever. The second wave, that's in the fall of 1918 in most locations, caused widespread illness and high mortality rates. The third wave caused widespread illness but affected fewer persons and caused fewer deaths. Now, interestingly, this part of the description could almost follow what we had seen with regards to first the Alpha or the Wuhan did cause deaths, but then the Delta came along, and the Delta was quite a beast of a virus, and it caused significant deaths across the world. And then you had what we could call the third wave, which was Omicron, and that was much milder, caused much less deaths. And again, I have to be clear, in those who were not previously exposed in any way to the spike protein. And so that could parallel. But if you notice at that point, the pandemic finished. That's what I expected in April of 2022. I literally closed my COVID down research and I thought this is over because now we have the virus spreading across the world. There is herd immunity, and that's it done. What I didn't anticipate was that in certain parts of the world, the immune system seems to have been so skewed that they would be unable to neutralize Omicron. and then we have an ongoing pandemic or epidemic where people are still being affected. This is now where we have serious concerns, or I have serious concerns, because this is now a separation of the pandemics. And this is why I now describe it as the whole of the first 3 years here was the first wave. Now we're coming into what appears to be a completely different disease. And this is very important. This is not like what we have seen before. And actually, even with regards to respiratory illness, it's not necessarily going to respond in the same way that it had. Now, here's an interesting thing about mortality that occurred in the flu pandemic at the time. When they looked at the mortality rates I'll pull this back up here. And what they found was that the mortality rates was significantly changed depending on which group was affected. So they found that the mortality rates among nurses and medical officers who were frontline, they were repeatedly exposed to the influenza H1N1 pandemic strain in clinics, in ambulances, and in open crowded wards. In the lethal second wave, during the second wave, these individuals had lower mortality than any other occupational group. And this was a pattern that they noticed across because they had been exposed to so much of the virus that their immune system, their mucosal immune system, was able to tolerate it. What they found is in the fall of 1980, they they mobilized training camps throughout the United States and Puerto Rico. They were affected by the influenza epidemics, and they found that the mortality rates were highest among the soldiers with the least military service. And 60% of them who died of influenza related pneumonia were soldiers with less than 4 months of military service. And this was quite significant at the time. So it meant that the exposure was protective. And that's about mucosal immunity. That's the natural immune system protecting even against a apparently more virulent virus. And so it was quite important at that point in order to make a difference. Now, mortality rates were extremely high. And I'm looking here is that even among the island populations, this was with the flu pandemic, when the pandemic influenza attacked island populations, mortality rates were often very high, sometimes extraordinarily so. West Samoa had a 22% mortality rate. And on the other hand, Philippines and Puerto Rico was only 1%. Hawaii was only 0.5%. And so it just depended on the prior exposure to virus that was causing the difficulty with regards to the severity of the infection. I'll come to the hypothesis at the end, but I want to take you through a few steps with regards to how I think this is relevant with what's going on in our COVID epidemic. This is an example of a lung, and I've got here a picture showing this is the right lung. This is the lobe, the upper lobe, a lower lobe. You can't see the middle lobe. This may be the middle lobe, actually. Lower lobe is here. And you can see here the main bronchus splitting. So left main bronchus, the right main bronchus here. And then this is showing you without the lung, all the bronchioles that will be spread in all the segments of the lung. This is a bronchial tree. And this is what a lung looks like. And this is the air exchange. As you take a deep breath in, it expands and you blow out the carbon dioxide, pull in more oxygen. And this is an ongoing process that occurs. Now, what was interesting is when you compared the Delta variant and the Omicron variant, the areas of this reddish pinkish area, this is where the virus was causing inflammation. And you can see down here that it was going down into the deep parts of the lower lobes and even the upper lobes on both sides. When you compared it to Omicron, Omicron tended to stay in the bronchioles, in the upper part of the airways, and didn't really go deep into the lung. And I'll show you the lung again so that you understand what I mean. So Omicron tended to affect this part of the lungs. So the bronchioles, so the central part of the lungs, and it didn't really go all the way deep into the lungs and cause inflammation there. And again, I show you the picture. So even though it could, it was certainly not as much as what happened with Delta. This is important because it is the inflammation in these parts of the lung that would impair the oxygen exchange so much that it would cause the patient, even on intensive care, to be dying. So, this is important in the context of how death occurs with regards to the variants of COVID 19. Then I'm going to take you to another part of a paper, or this was actually just an article that was shared. And this was here from Hong Kong. They were looking at Omicron and they were comparing it to Delta in the human bronchus as opposed to the lung. So this is following on. And this was in December 2021. So you have bronchus here, lung here. I'll show you the image so it's a bit bigger. So 24 hours post infection, 48 hours post infection. Green is the original, the Wuhan. Brown is Delta. Blue is Omicron. And what they found within 24 hours, you can find in the bronchus here similar levels of the original and the Delta. But compared to Omicron, significantly higher levels. Actually, the 70 times higher levels than Delta. And this is here again within 48 hours. Again, the Omicron remains the highest. When we look at the lungs, conversely, the original variant had the highest number of infected virons in the deep in the lungs, higher than Delta and certainly higher than Omicron. And this was again the same at 48 hours. So what it's showing you is that Omicron has a preference for infecting the bronchioles, and this has an impact, therefore, as we showed you here, on the severity of the lung disease. So why am I highlighting that? I think it's a matter of time, and Gert has pointed this out. It's a matter of time before you have a variant that is able to do both, which is to infect the bronchus quite avidly and infect the lungs quite avidly. And when that occurs, that is a very, very serious problem. And it's really relevant because the question that no one seems to want to address is why is the virus circulating in highly vaccinated regions? It's a very important question when we look at what can happen. And it seems that the mucosal immune response in the vaccinated populations is just not as effective. And so, therefore, there is circulating virus. It means that the population will continually be exposed to these variants. And then it could be a matter of time. And that's why in this image, I put 2024 question mark. How long will it take before that is occurring? So let's go back to the paper and we'll see why I thought this was so relevant. When they were looking at the analysis and they were looking at why did this response occur? Okay, so they think that when people were first exposed to the 1918 variant, the first variant that started the pandemic, that variant was not the same as the H1N1 that was in the second wave. So, what then happened is that the immune system for people who had only been exposed to the original variant, when they faced the H1N1 in the second part of the virus, they ended up with what they call an immune pathological response. So it wasn't just about the virus, it was the immune system to the virus that was causing most of the issues. So it seemed as though antibodies, they said, against the hemagglutinin of the seasonal strain did not provide complete protection against infection with the pandemic strain. And so, because it couldn't control it, you then went into a cycle, almost like a cytokine storm, that happened with regards to COVID 19. This process, this is what I'm concerned about, because I think that this could happen again, because the immune system, and this is what all the evidence is pointing to, is still responding very strongly to the original strain of the virus. And it's weaker to the Omicron variant. And this is very similar to the kind of problem that they had with regards to the 1918 flu pandemic. It was an inappropriate immune response, and therefore they could not neutralize the virus properly. When you add in on top of that IgG4, and IgG4 is primarily occurring with regards to mRNA vaccines, you then have an immune suppression effect. And while that may be protective, because that seems to be part of the reason why vaccines protect against severe COVID 19, because it doesn't seem that it's stopping the virus, but it's neutralizing the immune response to the virus. When those antibody levels fall, and you then have a potential cytokine response, and you combine it with secondary bacterial infection in the lungs, that is the nightmare scenario. I don't know, I should say, I don't know if this will happen, but based on everything that I've been looking at, I can't see how it will not happen. It's just, I don't know when. Because every time that, as long as the IgG4 antibodies remain elevated in the vaccinated cohort, I think this is unlikely to happen. They may have different presentations of disease, but it will not be that severe pathological lung inflammation. When the IgG4 levels fall and you have a variant that could reach deep into the lungs, then we have a problem. And that's how I'm thinking ahead. I'm not waiting for it to happen. I'm thinking about what do we do if it happens. That's the approach that I think we need to take from a clinical and a scientific perspective. Think about the risks. Try and observe the patterns. Come up with strategies that could mitigate it. Don't just hit and hope, as many of the scientific community is doing now. They are reassuring that this is okay and what we're doing is right. We are not looking properly at some of the risks that could occur in the context of a surging COVID pandemic and the mortality that could come along with it. Listen, as I said before, I don't mind being wrong, but I think it's important to reflect on what could occur. So I think that's about what I have to share. And I'm just quickly taking a look at some of the points here. And this is one here from Muller van Bosch said early autumn 2023, no 2024. I've listened to Gert many times, and it's very difficult to be accurate. And I think there are many mitigating factors that can impact on it. And so, therefore, it is difficult to know. And this is why I have put a question mark, because I don't know. Truthfully, in my heart of hearts, I do think that he may be right, autumn 2023. I hope he's not, because I don't think the world is properly prepared for what this could look like. I mean, immune system gets destroyed bit by bit the more shots you take. I don't think it's that the immune system is destroyed, but it's like having an army. Your immune system is like an army. It has multiple facets to it. It has an air force, it has a navy, it has the army on the ground, it has the marines, it has the paratroopers. And what I think we're seeing is that you are putting all of your resources into only one group of your army. It's kind of like building up your paratroopers' numbers so that they're in the millions and you're not spending any money on your Navy or your Air Force. And then what happens is that you are not prepared for different kinds of enemies. So it's not that the immune system is weaker. I just think that the immune system has been focused in a way that makes it difficult to be able to neutralize what we're seeing. Um, yes, I think you're right here. Nowhere to run and nowhere to live that is safe. Every second of our lives is golden. And with that point, I think you're quite right. This is where we are now. As I said, prepare for the worst, hope for the best. But not preparing, to me, is not an option at this point in the pandemic. Hope you have a good evening, and I hope you found this information valuable. Thank you very much.